Yes, I'm Joseph Alpert, Alpert, at J. Solotkin Company. That's capital J period, capital Solotken in Indianapolis, Indiana. The company was founded in 1914 by my maternal grandfather. My maternal grandfather immigrated to the United States from Russia at the age of 12 because he was going to be drafted into the Russian army for 20 years of service. So his parents put him on a boat to the United States, knowing that they'd never see him again. And at any rate, he came to the United States, could not speak English. He had an older brother living in Greenfield, Indiana. So originally he lived in Greenfield, but then he got a job as a delivery boy for the Dobberwitz kosher meat market. And that's where he met my grandmother, because her family had the kosher butcher shop, one of the kosher butcher shops in Indianapolis. Now we don't have any, unfortunately. But at any rate, so he got a job there, and he met my grandmother, and he started peddling, and he had a horse and wagon, and we always joked that the horse ate before the children, because that horse was his livelihood. So at any rate, he was also active in the Jewish Loan Society. As a member of the Jewish Loan Society in the 1920s, they had a friend of his also had a horse, and the horse died. So the Jewish Loan Society wanted to provide a replacement horse for my grandfather's friend. And they deliberated this, that, and the other thing, and a regular horse would cost $45. But they managed to find a horse with one eye that only cost $25. So that's what they did. I mean, these Jewish immigrants, as you can imagine, but they were, in my view, were hard-working people. My grandfather, the story goes that he would work from 4 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock at night, and then he would go to school to learn to speak English. And he did learn to speak English, but he was far more comfortable speaking Yiddish than he was speaking English. So at any rate, while I was in high school, my grandfather, Jacob Solotkin, was a very poor driver. He would wait until an oncoming car was almost on top of him, and then he'd decide to turn left. So my parents decided that I would be his designated driver as soon as I was able to get a driver's license. And whenever I was not in school, I could be his driver. So I remember taking him to Chicago one time. And at that time, this was in the mid-1950s, I'm 80 years old, and I've been working here at the scrapyard. It'll be 50 years on October 1st of this year. So I remember taking my grandfather to Chicago one time, and they would go to a restaurant called the Roosevelt Cafe, which was strictly kosher, and everybody spoke Yiddish. So I remember learning some profanity, because Yiddish profanity, because they would refer to one another as various Jewish slang words that I will not repeat because it's not for mixed company. At any rate, I came back to Indianapolis, and I asked my father, who was also working here at the time, and his name was Harry Alpert, and he was my grandfather's son-in-law. So at any rate, I asked my dad, Dad, everybody refers, when they go to Chicago with Grandpa to the Roosevelt Cafe, everybody refers to Epstein this, Epstein that. what's Epstein's first name? And my dad said to him, Mr. And so they've referred to this Mr. Joseph Epstein as Mr. because he financed the various small scrapyards within 100 or 200-mile radius of Chicago. And he was his company was called the Continental Paper Grading Company, but they were also in the rag business. And in the 1920s, my grandfather had very little money, so he would get whatever he could get for next to nothing. And one of the products was rags that they would sort. And in the 50s, we had 150 women sorting rags over conveyor belts. They would dump the loose rags on the conveyor in the basement or in the first floor of the building, and it went up on a conveyor to the third floor. And then it went along a horizontal conveyor, and these women were standing on either side of the conveyor, and they would pick out leather gloves, cotton gloves, wool gloves. They would pick out men's leather hats, ladies' felt hats, and nylon stockings, rayon stockings, cotton shirts, men's wool shirts, ladies' skirts, what have you. And they would sort all these different rags and then ship them to Mr. Epstein in Chicago. That was in the 20s. But later, as my grandfather grew and learned to develop the business, we were exporting rags to France, Italy, and Spain, where used clothing had a market unlike what they had here in the United States, because in the 1950s, I think, in the Eisenhower administration, they passed the Wool Labeling Act, which said any used wool in a garment had to be labeled as used wool if it was made into a garment sold in the United States. This was a result of the sheep farmers who wanted, of course, to protect their interest. And so from that time on, the market for used clothing here in the United States became extinct. And my dad, as well as my grandfather, would export rags to these European countries. And eventually that dried up too, because the Salvation Army and the Goodwill Industries and Volunteers of America were able to get the clothing free. It was donated to them. And even to this day, as you may know, the Salvation Army and the Goodwill Industries, they will refurbish used clothing and sell it in their stores here in the United States. So my dad decided the rag business was done. In 1956, the J. Solotkin Company eliminated rag purchasing here. So Dad expanded into waste paper. And Dad at one time was Dad, who worked here for 57 years, even though he had a law degree from the University of Indiana, where he finished number 2 Order of the Coif, which is like the Phi Beta Kappa of law school. He finished second in his class in 1936. And my grandfather really didn't want him to come to the scrapyard, but Dad was practicing law in 1936, and he had clients, but none of them had any money to pay him. So my grandfather invited his son-in-law, Harry Alpert, to come to the scrapyard, and thinking it would be just 3 to 4 months. It turned out that my dad, Harry Alpert, worked here at the scrapyard for 57 years until he was 89, and he died at the age of 91. So the fact that I've worked here for 50 years is no big accomplishment as far as my family is concerned, but I'm still working every day and enjoying it very much. Well, I graduated Indiana University in 1960, and then I went into the Army and was in the Transportation Corps. I worked at, I was at Fort Eustis, and then I was at Fort Story, Virginia. And then I came out of the Army, and I thought I was going to go right into the business, but Dad said, "You're not ready." So then I applied to graduate school, and I got an MBA from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in June of 1963. But once again, I thought I'd be ready to come to the scrapyard. My dad was, when I was 40, I thought he was nuts. But when I got to be 60, I realized he was a genius. At any rate, so my dad said to me, "Son, before you're going to come to the scrapyard and become a boss, you're not going to be a boss. Go get a job." I always say my dad was the Bobby Knight of scrap because um, I could make one mistake and I'd hear about it 20 times in the next year. And if I did 15 things right, that was just accepted. That's the way it should be. I should do things right. So at any rate, I then went to New York and I went to work for a company called Philip Brothers, who in 1963, they were larger than General Motors. Philip Brothers had offices in like 50 different countries. They had sales of over 8 billion in 1963. And like I said, that was more than General Motors had at the time. And I tell people I would have worked for them for $1 a year and I would have been well paid. Philip Brothers was, like I say, they had offices in many different countries, and they were Orthodox Jews who were Holocaust survivors. So we had a minyan every noon at, they had 350 people working in the New York office. But like I say, their headquarters was Zug, Switzerland. And the president of the company was a gentleman by the name of Philip Jesselson. And he was very philanthropic. He donated to a lot of the New York charities in the 50s and 60s and 70s. At any rate, the company Philip Brothers, um, Sunday was a regular work day. Saturday, of course, they were closed. But on work days, they would come in at odd hours of the day, including on Sunday, because at that time there was no emails like we have today. Everything was by telex, or like an international telegram. So if they wanted to send a message to Tokyo, where they had an office, they would compensate for the time difference. So it would be during normal working hours in Tokyo. They might have to come in at 3 o'clock in the morning, which they did, in order to communicate, because naturally things went very fast there at Philip Brothers. Philip Brothers, like I said, had over $8 billion in sales in 1963, and scrap was like 5% of their total business. But even though it was 5% of their total business, they were the largest merchant in scrap. But they also handled ores. They owned copper mines, they owned zinc mines, they owned lead mines, they owned tin mines, and they would buy. It was fascinating, and I try and apply some of these same principles to our company here in Indianapolis today. They would buy, say, the production of a zinc mine in Peru, and they would then ship that zinc to Turkey. They wouldn't get paid in the Turkish currency. They would get paid in something such as new steel, which then they would ship to Korea. And then they would ship that, and then they wouldn't get paid in that currency either. They would get paid in merchandise. So they might have a series of 4 or 5 transactions that would build upon one another, each one making a profit, but maximizing their profit by utilizing their merchandising skills to move material to the most needed spot to have very large profits. Um, so, like I say, even today in the scrap industry, it's not uncommon to have material processed and then you have it made into a form that you can upgrade or what I would call have a second tier profit. You, um, if you're fortunate enough to be able to market a form of scrap to a higher echelon user. So, so like I say, I worked there for 3 years. Then I went to work. I wanted to handle scrap at Philip Brothers. They didn't want me to do that. In the beginning, I did. I was working in the traffic department at Philip Brothers, but then they wanted to promote me into trading. But what was I going to be trading? Fish meal, which was a byproduct. They ground up anchovies that they were taking from a company in Peru. That fish meal was ground up into animal feed. It's a protein. It's a protein substitute that is used to send to farm animals. At any rate, they wanted me to do that, and I didn't want to do that. So I ended up changing companies, going from Philip Brothers to Manufacturers Hanover Trust. And there, I got hired by a fellow named Russ Pope, who I thought was going to be president of Manufacturers Hanover Trust. And I'd forget about going back to the scrapyard because I thought he would be president of the bank and I would be his right-hand man and I'd be set for life. And that was great until he got fired. And once Russ Pope got fired, they wouldn't let me wouldn't let me empty a wastebasket. Well, about that time, I got engaged to my wife, Barbara. We met on Memorial Day of 1967. We got engaged the following December of 67, and we got married on July 4th of 2068. And so I wanted to come back to the scrapyard. I still had a problem. She didn't want to move to Indianapolis. She loved the East Coast. She was from Trenton, New Jersey. Well, she said, well, in a year, I think I'll be ready to move to Indianapolis. Well, it actually was a year and 3 months, but we moved to Indianapolis in October of 69. So I started working at the J. Slotkin Company on October the 1st of 1969. That's why I know it'll be 50 years on October the 1st of 2019 working here. So at any rate, I've been very fortunate because I've had such great teachers. My dad, of course, was, I consider my closest mentor. And he was just wonderful. Well, like I say, it was wonderful, except I couldn't work for him. So I ended up working for my uncle, Leo Seelig, who was actually my dad's, let me think, Leo Seelig, who worked here for 52 years as well, started in the rag department. He was my great uncle because he was married to my grandmother's sister. And like I say, they were all Russian immigrants who knew more Yiddish than they knew English. Although Leo Seelig he spoke fluent English. And he started the metal department at the J. Slotkin Company. And but in the beginning, they had I'm talking at the 30s, they had so little money. We bought rags and paper and even rubber um, and sisal, or I remember yarn and rope and what have you like that. And this was various types of used material that they could afford. And little by little, Leo Selig, my grandfather's brother-in-law, they were married to sisters, um, developed a metal business. So I found it easier to work with Leo Selig than to work for my dad, because he would chew me out and tell me what I did wrong, and it would be forgotten. Whereas my dad would chew me out and bring it up to me 20 times over the next 6 months. So at any rate, I was, like I say, fortunate to have my father, first of all, and then Leo Selig as an advisor and mentor. But even I've always been, I love the Institute of what is now the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. Many people who've been able to withstand the ups and downs of the recycling industry have, I mean, I think it's true in any business, you're successful if you have repeat clientele. You know, if you're in it for the long term, um, I would say that would apply to most businesses. Um, I tell people your reputation precedes you wherever you go, and if you cheat somebody, it will come back to haunt you. So even in the past week, I bid on some aluminum scrap that I knew was contaminated with iron. But looking at it it was in a big pile. Looking at it from the top, the iron was just minimal. But once I received the load and it was dumped in our yard, the iron was like 30%, and I thought the iron was going to be 5%. Well, obviously, I made a bad quote and I made a bad buy. Well, we honored the purchase. We paid the agreed price. It meant that it was a loss of over $1,000 on a $7,000 purchase. I paid $7,600. I should have paid around $5,800, maybe $6,000. But I gave the guy the price, and it was my mistake. He says, and this was our second or third time doing business with him over a period of 5 or 6 years. And I always wanted to do business with him because I know he would have scrap on a regular basis. We honored the price. We took the loss because, like I say, I could have probably said, "Screw you! I don't want to. I'm not going to pay you for what I quoted you because what you showed me was not representative of what you were selling." At any rate, so even my associates here thought I was nuts for doing that, but somehow or another, I felt that it was my mistake. I should honor the mistake and make good on the offer. So we ended up paying for the scrap, and we still has it. Nobody wants to touch it and process it because it's going to be a headache to process and remove the iron, which we have to do before we can sell it as processed scrap. So at any rate, there are other names that I can recall that were, I don't know how much you know, but in the 50s, there was what we call the National Association of Waste Material Dealers. And then after that, that was like a trade organization made up of the rag people and the paper people and the metal people and everything. But that organization probably had 200 member companies. And then after that, there was the National Association of Secondary Material Industries. I think that was in the early 60s or late 60s. At any rate, the trade association kept growing and growing and growing, and we benefited because of that. because now we have a stronger voice in Washington. And even today, they're wanting to label certain forms of scrap as waste. And when it's designated waste, it receives all sorts of punitive legislation that are, of course, adverse to the recycling industry. And our current trade organization, ISRI, of course, is very, very successful in representing the members in Washington. But getting back to my story of how these trade associations, it was National Association of Waste Material Dealers. Then it was National Association of Secondary Material Industries. Then it was National Association of Recycling Industries. And along with those, as those organizations were maturing, there was also the Institute of Scrap Iron and Steel. And eventually they merged, I think 12 years ago, to form what is now known as the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, a merger of what is ISIS and NARI. And and before we had Robin Weiner, we had Herschel Cutler. Maybe you've heard the name Herschel Cutler. He was president of the trade association for maybe 20 years, and Robin Weiner was his assistant. And so she had a good teacher as well that led her to the position she now occupies. So, I mean, it's, for me, as you might imagine by now, the scrap industry is a passion. My wife, and we've been married 50 years now, and she says she wants me home, but not for lunch. So I keep coming to the office, buying and selling scrap and going through the plant, and we should do this and we shouldn't do that and this, that, and the other thing, and I'm living the dream. The scrap industry, I think, is analogous to the field of medicine in that when I was a college student, I went to the family doctor. He looked at me, and he had, if I had a chest pain, if I had a headache, if I had a stiff arm, he could treat me for everything. Today, you go to a specialist who can examine your pancreas, who can examine a different doctor will examine your foot, your elbow, your ear, your every conceivable. And the same as in the scrap industry. We now have specialists within specialists within specialists as the industry is matured. For instance, even in the Baltimore area, Baltimore is a large port. So there are companies in the Baltimore area that specialize in naval scrap. A company that I'm familiar with that was recently acquired by another company in Philadelphia was called Ansam Metals, ANSAM. I visited their yard the same time I went to the museum of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. At any rate, they had specialized equipment for processing naval scrap. You can imagine if you dismantle an ocean-going vessel, it could be a 2 or 3 year project to cut down the scrap to not only to reduce it in size, but to separate all the various metallic components by the nature of whether it's like there's something called admiralty brass. There's something else called naval brass that are similar but not identical, in that they have nickel, they have copper, they have zinc, they have aluminum, all alloyed together. Okay, but if you go into Chicago, there's nobody doing anything like that. On the other hand, you could go to Arizona, where there's companies that dismantle aircraft to capture the various. you can imagine how many different metals there are in a U.S. Large military plane, like a air cargo plane for the United States Navy or Army. I mean, so there are companies that are specializing within specialties. There's companies in the New Jersey area that recycle catalytic converters, which contain precious metals, and that's all they do. Like I say, so to me, I think there's a similarity between medicine and recycling, and they're specialists in specialists. There's companies that specialize in titanium, um, and so here in Indianapolis, there's the Rolls-Royce Corporation who builds jet engines, and we're getting all the scrap from Rolls-Royce, where they're building jet engines. Well, in the manufacture of jet engines, you have numerous alloys that are what we call high temperature alloys that are heat resistant. So, in a jet engine, you're going to have metals that have a very high melting point because the as they say, you'd rather be in the ground wanting to be in the air than to be in the air wanting to be on the ground. So they have various parts in a jet engine that has to have, and they check it in parts per million for impurities. Companies that recycle these high temperature alloys. Now we here, we are the next level down. We can check down to 0.01% for in various alloys, high temperature alloys, such as waspaloys, hastelloys, inconel. These contain, like I said, they're used in aerospace, and they contain nickel, titanium, cobalt, and tungsten, and then traces of niobium and other metals like that. And here at J. Slotkin Company, we can identify these impurities down to 0.01%. But the people we sell to, who are doing actually the melting of that material, they will check down to parts per million for impurities. I mean, like I say, and this is just an evolvement of the scrap industry in the past 20 years. You asked how it's changed in the past 20 years. It's changed remarkably so because we have these instruments that we call them handheld analyzers that can read down to, in our case, down to an 0.01 factor of various impurities in these high temperature alloys. So 20 years ago, we didn't have availability of that. We checked by checking the spark. In other words, you put a certain metal on a spark, and you can identify based upon if it gives a short red spark, it would indicate a high nickel content. If it gives a long spark, that indicates the absence of nickel, and it would be an abundance of iron. Many of these metals will contain iron, but iron, of course, lowers the value of the various types of scrap. We have greater membership today in the trade association. We have more. We have a larger voice in Washington. That is fabulous, and so we're just, like I say, I wish I were born 20 years earlier. But nevertheless, I mean, it's just such a fabulous experience that I've been able to. Before I forget, I want to mention two names that were very pioneers, I would say, in the scrap industry, particularly the metal portion of the business. A gentleman by the name of Sidney Danziger. He was from New York, and he he first of all, he never went past the fourth grade, but he wrote a letter on my bar mitzvah. He was a friend of my grandfather, and he wrote a letter that I still have on the occasion of my bar mitzvah. That, by the way, I wanted to be a rabbi when I was about 12 or 13 years old, but when I saw the abuse that the rabbi who I admired so here in Indianapolis, his name was William Greenfield. He was a conservative rabbi, and he helped write the prayer book that we used at the time. At any rate, he knew more English literature than my professors at Bloomington, where I studied English literature. He knew more English literature, and I used to caddy for him, the rabbi, and he was a terrible golfer. But I didn't mind caddying for him because I wanted to be with him. Anyway, he took all sorts of abuse. And so when I was watching that as a high school student, people I thought should just respect the rabbi for the name he has. And I would see people talk in abusive language about that really bothered me. And I knew I couldn't turn the cheek to continue as a rabbi. So when it was about a 2-year period of my life. Anyway, that's how I knew that I wasn't going to be a rabbi. Anyway, I forgot where I was going, but you asked about the environmental issues. So the fact of the matter is, we still have these issues where people consider scrap waste, and we have to speak up and tell our congressmen and senators that yes, the recycling industry is a very sound industry offering many jobs, and it's helpful to the economy. Unfortunately, we were selling a lot of our scrap to China, and because of the tariffs and the trade issues that the current administration is actually promoting, as you may know, tariffs that the Chinese are retaliating. And now we used to export here, even from Indianapolis. We're not on a port. We would export about 20% of our sales were for export. Now, less than 5% of our sales are for export. And as that has impacted us here in the Midwest, it's even greater on the East Coast, the West Coast, and the South, or any port, any of the ports like Baltimore, where even to this day, when we do export, we export from Baltimore. In other words, we ship it to the ramp, the ramp in Chicago. They transport the export container by rail from Chicago to Baltimore, and it leaves Baltimore for export to China, to Vietnam, to Taiwan, to Malaysia, and to India. So we're still exporting, but China was consuming like 40% of the scrap metal that was exported in the 90s and even in the 2010, and even as late as 2015, we were exporting. And naturally, the more consumers, the larger your marketing opportunities are, the greater your ability to execute sales, and the more better business you will enjoy. So as what the next stage will be, I'd like to think that I think China will no longer be a major player as far as exports. And all the other nations, all the other nations that I mentioned combined, they don't consume nearly the scrap that China was consuming. So to that issue, the scrap industry is currently under duress. So we've had issues in our history. Our company is 105 years old, but not just our company, our industry have issues continually cropping up. And the resilience is the remarkable thing at how we overcome um, obstacles and persist. And like I say, it's fabulous. The other name that really you should know, a gentleman by the name of Cy Wakesberg worked for, before it was ISRI, he, first of all, he was a journalist. And he helped when I was writing my master's thesis at the University of Pennsylvania. Sidney Danziger, who I mentioned earlier, and Cy Wakesberg, who both lived in New York City um, while I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. I would go from Philadelphia to New York, and they would give me time and help me with my master's thesis, which the subject of my master's thesis was eliminating an unprofitable department in a scrap um, metal business. And so, at any rate, I got a master's degree in accounting, and particularly cost accounting, because that was where my interests lie. And at any rate, those two names, but there were, I can mention, Teddy Gruen was another, um, Gruen. Teddy Gruen was, um, I mean, these names, most of the people living today, if I mention their names, they don't mean anything. But these were hardworking uh, Jewish immigrants that were just, they were just so resilient, so ingenious for figuring out a way to make a living. And like I say, I I've been fortunate to have such great mentors, and like I say, I'm still living the dream. One
That's
other
great.
thing, you probably one other thing, I'm dealing with the grandchildren of people I started with um, 40 years ago. The grandchildren don't question me if I tell them this is painted scrap. It's not going to enjoy the best price because it has some iron attachment, or it has this, or it has that. The grandchildren don't challenge me the way that their parents and grandparents did. So another reason I come to work every day, because I just I have so much freedom. I, there are other people. There are a number of people in their 80s that are still active in the business. One person you may know, I know, is Stanton Moss. He's in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. At any rate, he's 84 years old. He's we do a lot of business with him, and he has his own company called the Stanton Moss Company. And like even they used to meet at the Warwick Hotel in Philadelphia. It was called the Non-Ferrous Metals Association, and Stanton was active in that. And like I say, he's still, even at age 84, he's still very active. And but then on the West Coast, you may have heard of Alpert and Alpert. They're a company that is, they have an office, I think, in Tokyo, and they're all over the place. And they're also, well, one of their founders was president of NARI. My uncle Leo Seelig was president of NASME, and it was National Association of Recycling Secondary Materials Industries, at any rate. So I used to schlep around with those guys just to carry their suitcase. I just wanted to be there and listen as they would yell and scream at one another in Yiddish. I remember going to Paris, Illinois, um, maybe 45 years ago, and they had a small scrapyard there. The owner's name was Dave Abels, Abels, and had a pile of iron there. And the people from Chicago or Indianapolis or wherever would come and look at his pile, and he didn't want to know from price per pound or anything like that. What? Okay, here's a pile of iron. What are you going to offer for this? And so the buyers from Chicago would go and look at this pile of iron, and they'd go in and they start loading this pile of iron. And the bottom of the pile of iron were two um, World War I cannons that were 20,000 pounds each. They were there, and you paid for them, but you couldn't pick them up and take them with you. So, how many times he sold that same pile of iron without it moving? I mean, obviously, I don't know that that's funny, but there were people that were unfortunately looking to make a quick profit and not didn't have the scruples or the morals. So that was a story that I heard about when I was, in my early 20s. So I've got a citation from Mike Pence. He was governor of Indiana before he became vice president. So we had 100-year celebration for the company, and he gave me an award called the Sagamore of the Wabash, which it recognizes Hoosiers of note. Why I was signaled out for that, I don't really know, other than I had a friend that put my name up for that. So I have another certificate here from the state of Indiana where I'm recognized as a member of the Sagamore of the Wabash. And so, what can I say? I just, and I've got my children and grandchildren all over the walls here. My wife loved to decorate my office when we moved. We moved into a new building in 2010. I may have told you that. So we have a new building that we occupied beginning in March of 2010. Formerly, we were on the west side of Indianapolis from 1936 to 2008, and we bought this and renovated this property for 18 months before we moved in March of 2010.